Ladies and gentlemen, I want to speak this morning about how it is that we deal with vulnerability. How do we deal with other people's vulnerability? And by extension, how do we deal with our own vulnerability? The Torah describes in this morning's portion, which we read, one response to a particular type of vulnerability. People who had a certain type of condition, tzara'at, a skin illness that rendered them vulnerable, were quarantined, sometimes for 7 days, sometimes for longer. And the Torah uses the following phrase to describe this: Kol yemei asher hanega bo yitma tamehu badad yeshev michutz lamachane moshavo. So long as a person is afflicted with this condition, that person will dwell alone. That person's dwelling is michutz lamachane, outside of the camp. This was done because quarantine was necessary in order to protect other people. This person, our ancestors recognized, was contagious. And so the quarantine was a way of making sure that this person's source of vulnerability would not adversely impact other people. But the question that I want to ask us to consider honestly this morning is the extent to which our fear of vulnerability causes us to impose quarantine on other people, causes us to, as it were, send other people michutz lamachane, outside of the camp. There are many sources of vulnerability. We may have vulnerability due to health. We may have some of vulnerabilities that accrue as we get older. We may have vulnerabilities that have to do with our mental state or our emotional and spiritual state. And the question is, to what extent are we, sometimes unconsciously, sending other people away because their vulnerability makes us uncomfortable, most likely because we don't want to deal with the realities of our own vulnerability? For a couple of days, people in the United States and beyond were talking about what took place at the recent Oscar ceremony. And it provided, one might say, a diversion from all of the traumatic events that are taking place in the world, in Ukraine, in other places. And we were talking about what went on between two men on a stage. And I'm not going to focus on that this morning, though there is much that one could discuss. I want to focus on what took place between two women on a stage. And the women I'm speaking about are the entertainers, Lady Gaga, who is in her 30s, and Liza Minnelli, who is in her 70s. These two women came on the stage in order to present the Best Motion Picture Award, which interestingly went to a film, Coda, that deals with a community that is often marginalized, people who are deaf, who sometimes we might like to pretend don't exist. So that was very interesting in and of itself. Liza Minnelli is suffering from some condition that has impacted her physically and that has also impacted her cognitively. And so Lady Gaga, you may have seen this, went on stage with her. At a certain point, noticing that Liza Minnelli seemed to need some direction, said to her, "Don't worry, I got you." And Liza Minnelli said, "I know." And at a certain point, Liza Minnelli seemed to be struggling with her note cards, and Lady Gaga helped her, and the people who were there were invited to show their respect and their appreciation for Liza Minnelli for all of the years of beautiful service that she offered as an entertainer. Now, some people responded to the whole thing and said that should never have happened. It embarrassed Liza Minnelli. She should never have been brought on stage in her compromised state. And looking into it, it appears that this was something which was discussed. This was something that Liza Minnelli wanted to do. And what I'm wondering aloud to all of us this morning is, to what extent was the discomfort with seeing Liza Minnelli in her natural state, who she is right now, to what extent did that discomfort come from a discomfort that we all have with vulnerability, that we all have with what happens to people, that we all have with the realities of what it is to be a human being living on this earth? If we pretend that something doesn't exist, does that mean it doesn't exist? And it raises a deeper question, which religious traditions overall, and our tradition specifically, wrestles with and has what to say about. And that deeper question is, what is the value of a human being? Are we valuable when we can produce what society thinks is worthwhile? Or do we have a value that transcends our capacity to produce in a certain way? Is there only one way to define strength? Is there only one way to define beauty? All of these are questions which our tradition asks, and what we say is that a human being's value comes from each of us carrying a divine spark, each of us being created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, in the image of our Creator. That's not about transaction, that's about value that transcends whatever transaction may be taking place. It is human nature, perhaps, to value physical beauty, to value youth and strength. So sometimes we marginalize those who lack physical beauty or who lack physical strength. And what a shame. What are we missing by marginalizing people michutz lamachaneh, outside of the camp, when their vulnerability makes us uncomfortable? What are we missing? There is an entirely different strain within the Torah, not about bringing people outside of the camp for whatever purposes, but about recognizing people as they are and trying our best not to subvert them, and in fact to invite them into the camp. Lo tikalel cheresh, we're going to be reading. You're not supposed to curse at someone who is deaf. You're not supposed to put a stumbling block before somebody who is blind. Well, clearly, but the implication is you're supposed to do more to invite everyone to be part of. Bipnei seva takum v'hadarta pnei zaken. When you see somebody who is older, you're supposed to get up and rise on your feet. That is something which many societies have preserved. In the United States, we're not as good at that as we should be. And we need to remember that a human being derives value by virtue of their divine spark, and that value exists and in many ways even increases over the lifespan. I want to conclude by sharing some of the incredibly beautiful and poignant words that were offered at a particular funeral ceremony for a woman who served Medinat Yisrael with incredible honor and grace and strength. Her name is Shulamit Aloni. Shulamit Aloni was a firebrand. She was a lawyer. She fought her whole life to make sure that those people who were marginalized would have their voice appropriately amplified. And at the end of her life, she suffered physically, and her cognitive capacity diminished. And her son said the following as she was laid to rest: I want to say something about the last year of my mother's life. Many people who came to pay condolences with the best of intentions asked me to remember her at the height of her powers, not only in her illness and her weakness. Her heroism will be told by the good and the many. I have also told, and I'll continue to tell it, but I would like to end my remarks with the memory of her weakness. She was so beautiful also in her weakness. Yet we are so afraid of old age and dementia, and we don't always know how to open our hearts at the moments when the mind fades, but the heart remains open to love like a child. When one door shuts, another one opens. And after I overcame the fear of meeting this brilliant woman in her dementia, I came closer and hugged her. And every day we would sit together and admire together the beauty of her cypress tree and the blooming of the bougainvillea at its top. Every day we spoke about how beautiful was this tree. Sometimes we need to recalibrate. And I am asking us to think about the pieces of us that lead us consciously, sometimes unconsciously, to marginalize those who make us uncomfortable for whatever reason. And I'm asking us to think about that Tselem Elohim, that spark that is the source of our infinite value. We may want to send certain people michutz lamachaneh, outside of the camp, but we should only do that if we are genuinely protecting them and other people, not falsely protecting ourselves and making ourselves feel better when in fact we have a lot that we need to learn. We all belong betoch hamachaneh, inside of the space of the sacred camp. No matter our circumstance, no matter what phase of life we are in, we all have so much to give and so much to receive from each other. Shabbat Shalom.